The United States has long been a steadfast supporter of Israel. But can growing criticism of President Biden's handling of Gaza turn the tides? And are fears of a wider war shifting attention away from Israel's continued assault on the Palestinians? We'll ask the renowned economist and director of Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Development, this week's headliner, Jeffrey Sachs. Up front.
Great to be with you.
On April 13th, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles towards Israel following a deadly Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. It's the first time Iran has directly attacked Israel, while Israel is weighing how it's going to respond to Iran's attack. And global leaders at the same time are saying, hey, you need some restraint here. The U.S. said that it wants to see these tensions de-escalate and that it wouldn't join Israel in any military retaliation against Iran. Question for me is the U.S. doing enough, though, to restrain Israel?
Probably not at some level. I think Israel will do something. It won't be helpful to anything. Israel started this round of escalation with the attack on the diplomatic compound in Damascus. Pretty brazen. I'd say more than pretty brazen, very brazen. Rather illegal, contrary to the Geneva Conventions on attacking diplomatic sites, a clear escalation, and I think clearly intended to pull the U.S. Into a war with Iran, which is probably Netanyahu's dream. I don't think that's going to work. It's a terrible idea, terrible for Israel, terrible for the United States.
And the U.S. has been pretty unequivocal about that. Biden said, we're not getting pulled into a military war.
Right, and Netanyahu seems to think that he really runs the U.S. government, and sometimes it feels
not always
that way.
wrong. Yeah.
Exactly, sometimes it feels that way. So he doesn't take Biden at face value in that sense. He thinks he can manipulate things or force the hand of the United States or get the U.S. to come meekly behind what Israel says, because after all, the U.S. keeps saying no red lines, ironclad commitment, and all the rest. But it's been clear this is not what the U.S. should do and what it wants to do. But Netanyahu is provoking. I do think, again, though there are some serious uncertainties about what really happened with the Iranian attack, it seems more likely than not that there was some pretty bad news for Israel in that several apparently hypersonic missiles got through and hit their targets. That's got to be absolutely alarming for Israel. So I think purely on a military calculation, this was not a good week for Israel.
And also in terms of the perception of Israel, prior to October 7th, there was an idea that they were almost impenetrable, at least at home. And now the fact that Hamas was able to sort of successfully breach the borders, the fact that, we see things going on all around the globe that makes Israel look weak, does that provoke Israel to engage in more aggressive activity?
Well, I think it has deeply called into question the strategy and the tactics of this particular cabinet. This is an extremist, nationalist Israeli cabinet, the most extremist in history. It does believe in a greater Israel. It does believe in permanent apartheid or worse, ethnic cleansing, or whatever is needed for Israel to keep its control and to prevent a Palestinian state. And what is happening is that fundamentally the world does not support that agenda. The world, even the United States, and I would say the American public, is pretty aghast at what they've seen. And even the political class in the U.S., which is absolutely, typically 100% behind Israel, is shocked and not going down that line. So Israel's got itself into a terrible mess because of its extremism, doesn't know what to do. Netanyahu's normal modus operandi is when you're in a mess, escalate. And that, I think, is still probably odds on to what they'll try to do.
The U.S. has historically taken a very aggressive stance toward Iran, including pulling out of the Iran deal in 2018. For decades, they've imposed economic sanctions under multiple presidents, with more announced after the attack over the weekend. The U.S. has also allied with Israel and Arab countries like the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all against Iran. Has U.S. policy in the Middle East enabled the possibility of a wider war?
Well, I think the first point, the most decisive thing that's happened vis-a-vis Iran is that Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have had a rapprochement. They're going to be together, it seems, in the BRICS, in this enlarged grouping, although with Saudi Arabia it's not 100% clear that that's the case. But definitely there has been a diplomatic reconciliation of sorts. Israel's war in Gaza, which has been so much more shocking and devastating than people would have imagined, have really pushed Iran and the Arab world closer together, not farther apart, despite what Israel hopes and what U.S. strategy has been. So I don't think that the U.S. And Israel can maintain any kind of coalition with the major Arab countries against Iran at this moment. Israel is making that absolutely impossible because of Israel's extremism. That puts the U.S. On the back foot vis-a-vis China, for example, which has been diplomatically extremely successful in the Middle East. It was interesting in the UN Security Council session after the Iranian attack, you also heard, even from an American ally as close as Korea, some words of caution against Israel that you would not normally have heard. Korea depends on the Middle East for its energy. It does not want this thing to explode. So I think at the core of this is a failed Israeli political strategy.
Not a failed U.S. Middle East policy over decades.
Well, more fundamentally, absolutely, the U.S. has enabled a failed Israeli strategy, a terrible one. So I do completely agree that that the U.S. policy in the Middle East is failing terribly. It's leading to wider war. Even if the U.S. wants to restrain that, it's not restraining the wider war. Why? Because at the crux of this conflict is an unsolved political problem with Israel and Palestine that absolutely needs to be solved. And all of the anti-Iranian dimensions have a very large source in the Palestine-Israel conflict, after all. There's no intrinsic reason why Iran would be the great enemy of the United States. Even with all the history, the U.S. has a lot to apologize for to Iran, starting in 1953 with the overthrow of the democratic government and the installation of a police state, after all. So there could have been a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. I've always wanted that. I thought the U.S. should have signed the JCPOA and implemented it. And of course, that was subverted by Trump. Biden was weak, as he has been in so many areas, of not bringing that back to life. Biden has been weak in allowing Netanyahu to continue his extremist agenda. And here we are with massive failures building up, not just in the Middle East, but we have crises all over the world. And I would say it's because U.S. foreign policy is out of date, outmoded, and with weak leadership.
You talked about this sort of enduring problem in the Middle East, specifically in Israel-Palestine. There's been a lot of renewed interest in Israel-Palestine, specifically around the so-called two-state solution.
Yes.
The U.S. has always said they've supported the two-state solution, whatever that might mean to them. And they have always articulated that as a kind of pathway toward Palestinian statehood. They want Israel and Palestine to negotiate directly in this regard. That's been a U.S. position. You know, I'm not sure how viable or possible that is.
Well, you know, my thought is, okay, yeah, there have been negotiations now for decades. We're done with that phase. Now we implement the two-state solution.
Right.
It's been clear all the way back to the Six-Day War in 1967 what the outcome has to be, which is a state of Palestine on the pre-war borders and a state of Israel, and they're living side by side. They may not like each other. Maybe there's a barrier between them, but there are two states. And this has been clear for 57 years. The U.S. has said...
Let me push back on that for
Yes.
two reasons. One, there seems to be a growing sense in the global community, and certainly among Palestinian civil society, that
Yeah.
the two-state solution is actually not only undesirable, but non-viable.
Right.
Because of settlement expansion, because of Israel's refusal to stand down on this claim of greater Israel, all of it is ours. That really there's a one-state reality that can only be repaired with a one-state solution, a single secular democratic state.
Yeah, I think that right now there's an overwhelming sentiment in the world to implement the two-state solution, which has been on the table and is embodied in probably dozens of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions over many, many decades. On both sides of this divide, which is a terrible, brutal divide, there is a one-state solution. Of course, many in Palestine say one state, Palestinian majority, and that's it. On the Israeli side, we know this current government is for one state, completely an Israel-dominated state. My view is that, practically speaking, these two sides do not get along, and there maybe in future generations, someday they will get along. But for the moment, the right answer is the one that has been embodied in resolution after resolution, but never enforced. And I agree, we're coming to the end of that road. The UN Security Council is getting ready for a vote on Palestinian membership in the UN based on the two-state solution.
What does that mean? Talk to me about what that means as a practical matter. Perhaps recognition of Palestine as a state, membership
That would be
status.
phenomenal.
It'd be phenomenal. But you still have Netanyahu who's saying, perhaps as a pretext, but that post-October 7th, we can't even have a conversation about a two-state solution, that a permanent, durable solution has to include Israel having security control over Gaza and over the West Bank. If that's the case, then is this all just for nothing?
No, because I don't think Netanyahu has the final word in this. I think the world community has the final word. And if we find, as I believe to be the case, that there's an absolutely overwhelming global sentiment, this war has to stop. Israel has to stop killing the people of Gaza. The two sides do not have to trust each other, love each other, like each other, even tolerate each other, but they have to coexist side by side without the killing. I think that this means saying to Netanyahu and this extremist government, if you can't implement that, it's going to be a different one onward, but this is the will of the international community under the UN Charter. And that, I believe...
Israel doesn't find the UN Charter very persuasive.
Yes, but Israel depends entirely on the U.S. backing to repudiate the UN Charter.
So that's the point that I want to drill down on a little bit. It seems to me that it's far more important for the United States to assert its power than for the international community. Israel says, hey, ICJ, we don't care. ICC, we don't care. Geneva Conventions, not so important. But if Biden makes that call and says, hey, no more money, hey, no more vetoes.
I would put even more explicitly, just no more bombs.
Fair enough.
You can't fight tomorrow without our munitions, which is literally the case. So I think that's right. The U.S. will not do that just on its own by saying, oh, it would be nice to have a two-state solution. It will not do that. On the other hand, if the overwhelming global majority says that's the right way, then the U.S. has a different choice.
Hasn't that always been the case? I mean, for the last few decades, hasn't the global community effectively spoken out against the settlements in the West Bank, effectively said that funding for Israel should be conditional upon human rights abuses going away, but we still see the siege in Gaza?
Yes.
The international community hasn't been unclear about this.
No, I agree. It has not been unclear, and the U.S. has been temporizing, protecting Israel, and delaying up until now. Now we have, I believe, a genocide underway. I think it is absolutely a disaster. And I think the world community is more alarmed and more shocked and more saying, if we are anything as a world community, we have to implement what we've said. An example, the vote on membership is a vote that should have happened 13 years ago.
Absolutely.
Because this was an application by the Palestinian Authority in 2011 for membership. When you make that application, it goes to an admissions committee, a new members committee, which is constituted by the UN Security Council. They did all the work. They said Palestine qualifies. The U.S. blocked it. And the U.S. blocked it, saying, it's not quite right now, not quite time. But take observer status. That's pretty good, and soon enough you'll be a member. Now we're 13 years later. There is a genocide underway in Gaza. There is the risk of a wider war. It's true. You could say, well, Mr. Sachs, wasn't all of this true 13 years ago? I would say, yes, it was true 13 years ago. But 13 years later, the dangers to the whole world are much greater, and the prevarications of the United States are so much more evident as well. So to my mind, I want to give another push. Okay, United States, you said back in 2011 it's going to happen quickly. We're farther and farther away because you have backed something that is against international law. You have sided repeatedly on the ground with Israel, even though it's direct violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. I want to push so that we actually live like responsible grown-ups, saying what we say, we do. We have international law, we apply it. And I think this is a moment, if again it fails and fails, well, you're absolutely right. This will go down in history as A, a disaster, and B, as a long period of hypocrisy of shocking dimension, and C, somebody will have to come up in the next generation with different answers. But right now we have an answer that is viable, workable, practicable, and the question is for the United States, are you going to apply what the whole world says is needed and what the U.S. itself says is needed, or are you going to continue to fake it? My basic argument to the U.S. is it's no good for the U.S., but it's also no good for Israel. Israel's legitimacy is shot by all of this. You go around the world, as I do all the time, people are aghast at what Israel is doing, and young people around the world are saying, what the heck is this? This kind of government has no legitimacy at all. And so Israel needs to change for its own survival. That's my own view.
That's an interesting question that you raise. You know, is it time for Biden and maybe other U.S. politicians to change course? I mean, there's a way that Biden is simply following the course that every presidential candidate has followed. You stand with Israel. There's no daylight.
That's it.
There's nothing between us. But now there's a generation of voters that are looking at this differently. I would say since Operation Cast Lead, certainly since Protective Edge, people have said, wait a minute, that's a lot of killing. That's a lot of death.
You're absolutely right. This is the first time that the American public has really focused on this in a very long time. And what they're seeing, they don't like. And the politicians are shocked.
Yeah.
Politicians don't like kind of hanging out where the public isn't.
Yeah.
But they've been so trained. A guy like Biden, I mean, this is decades, never show any daylight between Israel and you.
It's like a certain kind of fundamentalism I'm watching here.
That's the first rule.
Yeah.
Not a word, not a peep. And he's pretty much sticking to that, except for we hear the gossip of what he calls Netanyahu, et cetera, but
the leaks. I call those press leaks.
Exactly. but on the public pronouncements, it's the old school. Now, if Biden's not old school, what is he? I mean, he's completely old school. But what's shocking for them is it doesn't play. Yeah. It may play with some big donors, but it's not playing with the public, and they got to worry about the public. After all, at some point, what the public thinks matters in this country, especially in a November election.
Absolutely. Talk to me about the short term. We understand the kind of long-term goals here around statehood, around kind of creating a kind of global peace. But in the short term, people are dying and
Absolutely.
People are starving. How do we get to a ceasefire right now?
The reason we don't have a ceasefire right now is actually the long term, strangely enough. There's no endpoint even agreed. That's why Israel won't even agree to a permanent ceasefire. It says maybe ceasefire for 3 weeks or 6 weeks. Hamas says, well, that just means they're going to come back and slaughter us 6 weeks from now. Why doesn't Israel agree to something longer? Because then people ask, well, what is longer? And when Israel says, well, we're in control, no, that can't be longer. That's not an answer. So you have to have a point on the horizon where you're heading. That's why I want to clarify that by saying two-state solution, Palestine, member of the United Nations. We know where we're heading. There are a lot of details to work out in implementation, but we know where we're heading. So we're not arguing, Bibi, about that anymore. It's not what you care, what you say, what Smotrich says, what Ben-Gvir says about 2 states, 1 state, 3 states, greater Israel. That's done. The world's spoken. We know where we're going. Now we have to stop the fighting. To my mind, that will become absolutely directly more clear once that direction is settled. So I see it actually that many times, if even you want to start your hike up the mountain, you have to know where we're heading so you know what path you're going to follow. Once Palestine is voted in, I hope this week, really hope the United States does not block this again, because it would block it standing against the entire world.
That may be political
community.
suicide for Biden.
I think it would be. And so I'm hoping they have enough sense. Of course, these advisors need to recalibrate everything that they ever learned in politics, but they need to get this right. Then, okay, what's the point of the war anymore? Because now we have Palestine entering the UN. By the way, the clause is as a peace-loving nation. You have to accept the UN Charter. You enter as a peace-loving nation. That actually means something. It means that all of the countries in the region are oriented towards Israel's security as well as the Palestinian state security. So everybody has to take practical steps as soon as that happens. The Saudis, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel and the United States, all the rest. Okay, we have to stop the arms flows. We have to stop the killing. We have to start with the emergency services once again. We have probably 1 million people on the brink of starvation right now, so there needs to be massive, massive infusions of emergency food aid. Of course, this could start immediately if there is a political framework. There is not going to be a political framework on a process in which it's surely not this Israeli government, but I don't think any Israeli government in the near future is going to, quote, negotiate this. But the world can say, this is international law. This is how it's going to be. Stop your dreams of greater Israel. We're moving to the two-state solution.
To that point, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a moment. If the global pressure mounts the way you're describing, do you see U.S.-Israel relations changing? Do you see U.S. policy toward Israel fundamentally shifting?
Fundamentally, it has to shift because it can't give a blank check. The current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you want, we stand with you ironclad and ship the money your way. That's an impossible policy. All you do if you're a big power like the United States and you tell another country that's dependent on you, you choose everything. All you do is invite the craziest kind of extremism, because they say, we got the U.S., we manipulate the U.S. Bibi thinks he runs the U.S. And you know, as we said, he's got some evidence on his side up until now. The U.S. has to put some clear markers on this. We have a policy. We don't want to divide with the rest of the world. We don't want it to be 2 countries, Israel and the United States, against the other 191 countries. We have some basic standards based on the UN Charter. Once Israel hears that, things will change, but that's a big change from now, because the current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you need or what you want, we back you.
Jeffrey Sachs, thanks so much for joining me on Up Front.